Billy Bob Thornton and Angelina Jolie stand frozen in the memory of an era when Hollywood felt both brighter and heavier, where their names carried a kind of electricity that made the world pause. In the early 2000s, their bond was spoken about with awe, confusion, admiration, and fear all at once. He was the soft-spoken Arkansas storyteller shaped by hardship and humility. She was the rising star forged by a childhood lived under the heat of the spotlight and the weight of expectations she never asked for. Together they created a connection so intense that it felt as if the world could not look away. Yet behind the flashbulbs and whispered headlines was a quieter truth. Neither of them fully understood at the time. Their marriage, celebrated for its passion, unraveled in a way that left fans wondering for decades what truly happened between them. Now, 20 years later, Billy Bob Thornton finally opens the door to the emotional reality of why it ended, revealing a story far more human, tender, and complicated than anyone imagined. And it begins long before their love ever did. Billy Bob Thornton's story begins far from the bright lights that would one day surround him, in the quiet rural stretches of Arkansas, where he was born in the year 1955. His childhood unfolded in a home where resources were scarce, and the rhythm of daily life was marked by the kind of financial hardship that leaves an imprint on a young mind. He grew up knowing the weight of doing without, learning early that dreams were luxuries people like him were rarely encouraged to chase. Yet even in those modest surroundings, he carried a sense of wonder, a belief that stories lived inside him, waiting for the right moment to be heard. Before acting ever entered his world, baseball held his heart. On dusty fields under the southern sun, he imagined a future shaped by the simplicity of the game. But life shifted, as it often does, pushing him toward a different path. By the time he reached adulthood, he felt the pull of storytelling, the desire to stand inside a character and speak a truth larger than himself. Hollywood, however, was unforgiving. During the 1980s, he faced setback after setback, navigating years defined by rejection, odd jobs, and doubt. He was the man standing on the outskirts of the industry, knocking on doors that never seemed to open. What kept him moving was a resilience born from those early years in Arkansas. He knew survival. He knew how to keep going when everything around him suggested turning back. That persistence carried him to the moment that changed everything. Sling Blade in 1996. He wrote it, he directed it, and he stepped into the role that would redefine his career. Almost overnight, the man who spent years feeling invisible became one of the most celebrated voices in American film. Yet with that success came a strange discomfort. Fame sat awkwardly on him, a garment he had never been tailored for. Throughout his life, Billy Bob Thornton spoke openly about his struggles with anxiety and obsessive behaviors. These were not distant stories told with detachment, but intimate truths he shared with quiet honesty. His mind worked in ways that made the world overwhelming, and the pressures of Hollywood only intensified those feelings. Crowded rooms felt suffocating. Red carpets felt impossible. Spotlight attention clashed sharply with the shy, uncertain boy who grew up in Arkansas, the one who learned to shrink himself so life would not feel so heavy. Before crossing paths with Angelina, he had already walked through several marriages, each one marking a chapter of growth, heartbreak, and self-discovery. Melissa Lee Gatlin, Tony Lawrence, Cinda Williams, and Pietra Dawn Cherniak were part of the emotional map he carried into adulthood. Each relationship taught him something about himself, but none erased the doubts he held deep inside. He was a man shaped by love, loss, and the lingering belief that he was somehow unworthy of the life unfolding around him. By the time he met Angelina, he was celebrated but uneasy, accomplished but conflicted, admired yet deeply unsure. His past had carved a vulnerability that never left him. He was the man who rose from nothing, yet still felt like an outsider peering into a world where he did not quite belong. And this sense of not belonging would later become one of the quiet undercurrents shaping the marriage that defined so much of his public life. Angelina Jolie's story begins in the glow and shadow of Hollywood legacy. Born in 1975 to actors Jon Voight and Marceline Bertrand. From the very start, her life existed in two worlds, one shaped by the grandeur of her father's career, and the other shaped by the tenderness and resilience of her mother, who carried the emotional weight of raising two children after the family fractured. Her parents' separation marked her childhood in ways she would not fully understand until adulthood. What she did understand, even as a young girl, was the ache of absence and the longing for connection that felt steady and true. Growing up, Angelina was surrounded by the glamour of the industry, but felt strangely distant from it. She admired her mother's quiet strength more than any spotlight. Marceline Bertrand nurtured her daughter's sensitivity, encouraging her to embrace both the softness and the fire within her. That combination would later become her signature: bold, expressive, emotionally fearless. But as a child, it meant she felt everything deeply, carrying her feelings close to the surface where the world could easily touch them. Her early acting training at the Lee Strasberg Theatre Institute became a refuge. There, she shed the expectations that came with her last name and learned to step inside characters who allowed her to understand herself. She discovered the power of emotional honesty, something she had been yearning for since her family split apart. Acting was never just a career for her. It was a language through which she processed the complexities of her life. She brought intensity, vulnerability, and a rawness that set her apart from her peers. By the late 1990s, that emotional depth caught the world's attention. Her breakthrough performance in Girl, Interrupted in 1999, revealed her rare ability to bring unfiltered truth to the screen. Audiences were captivated. She wasn't simply playing characters. She was exposing pieces of her own soul, pieces shaped by the pain and resilience of her childhood. Recognition came quickly, but behind the accolades was a young woman still searching for belonging, still seeking a space where she could lay down the weight she carried inside. In the early 2000s, she began humanitarian work that would define much of her adult life, traveling to refugee camps, meeting families who had lost everything, and witnessing suffering far beyond Hollywood's edges shifted her perspective. She found purpose in serving others, grounding herself in compassion rather than celebrity. This chapter revealed a woman who wanted to understand the world in its fullness, the beauty and the tragedy, the triumphs and the losses. Her heart opened wider, fueled by a desire to bring meaning to lives beyond her own. Throughout these years, Angelina developed a reputation for bold personal expression. Whether through her creative roles, her appearance, or her emotional candor, she was unafraid of being seen as she truly was. This openness made her magnetic, unforgettable, and at times misunderstood. But it also made her profoundly human. She was a young woman navigating the shadows of her past, trying to build a life rooted in truth, connection, and authenticity. When her path eventually crossed with Bob Thornton, the bond they formed was intensified by these shared wounds. Both carried childhood fractures. Both knew what it felt like to live between worlds. Their connection grew not from perfection but from recognition. The quiet understanding that two very different lives could feel strangely alike at their emotional core. When Bob Thornton and Angelina Jolie met on the set of Pushing Tin in 1999, neither of them expected their lives to shift so suddenly. They arrived as two actors carrying their own histories, their own wounds, their own quiet hopes for something honest, in a world that often felt staged. What they found in each other was not the polished perfection Hollywood likes to sell, but something far more powerful: recognition. It was as if both had been walking through years of emotional noise, only to hear their own voice echoed in someone else for the first time. Their connection deepened quickly, shaped by long conversations, shared silences, and a sense of safety neither of them had felt in years. The set of Pushing Tin faded into the background as they gravitated toward each other with a natural ease. They were two imperfect hearts, carrying scars from childhood, adulthood, and everything in between, yet drawn together by a pull that felt undeniable. For them it was lightning striking twice, unexpected, fierce and impossible to ignore. By the year 2000 they married, stepping into a partnership that felt both grounding and electrifying. To the outside world, their relationship was marked by intense affection, a closeness that made headlines and stirred curiosity. But behind those public images was a quieter, more intimate truth. Billy Bob saw in Angelina a woman whose fire came from a lifetime of yearning to be understood. Angelina saw in him a man who carried tenderness tucked beneath layers of self-doubt. Together they created a space where vulnerability felt not only possible but welcomed. Their bond was unlike anything either had experienced before. They moved through the world with an intensity that frightened some and fascinated many. People saw the surface, the closeness, the emotion, the connection, but what they missed was the gentleness beneath it. Billy Bob and Angelina had both lived years feeling like outsiders. When they found each other, it felt like coming home to a place neither knew existed. Yet the very depth that made their love feel so consuming also made it overwhelming. Both would later describe their relationship using that same word, passionate, yes, but overwhelming in ways neither had expected. It was not a lack of love that complicated their marriage. It was the force of it. Two people who had spent their lives trying to manage emotional storms suddenly found themselves sharing one. They cared deeply, felt intensely, and lived in a way that kept nothing hidden. That kind of closeness can be beautiful, but it can also be hard to sustain. Still, in those early years they moved with a warmth and sincerity that made their connection unforgettable. They traveled together, worked together, supported each other, and navigated the chaos of fame with the kind of solidarity rarely seen in Hollywood. Billy Bob, often uncomfortable in the spotlight, found comfort in Angelina's presence. Angelina, often searching for grounding, found it in his steadiness. They were two souls trying to fit the pieces of their lives together, building something real inside a world that demanded performance. Their relationship was not a fairy tale, but it was deeply human. It was the story of two people who carried their wounds openly, who found love in a moment when neither expected it, and who tried with all the tenderness they had to make that love a home. By the time the early 2000s settled in, the beautiful intensity that once pulled Billy Bob Thornton and Angelina Jolie together began to shift under the weight of reality. What they shared was never questioned. The love was genuine, the connection was real, and the tenderness between them carried a sincerity rare in Hollywood. But as their lives grew louder and more divided, the soft threads holding them together began to stretch in ways neither could fully control. Billy Bob had long been open about his discomfort with Hollywood's high-profile lifestyle. From the beginning, he struggled with the crowds, the cameras, the constant expectation to be present in spaces that made his anxiety impossible to hide. He avoided large public events not out of disinterest, but out of a deep internal battle that had been part of him since childhood. Even as his career soared, he felt most at home in quiet rooms, behind the scenes, where the world did not demand so much of him. Angelina, rising rapidly in her career and in the public eye, began living a life filled with global work, humanitarian commitments, and the growing attention that came with her success. Billy Bob explained in interviews over the years that they were simply living in different worlds during this time, not emotionally, not in the heart, but in the day-to-day reality of their lives. She was traveling, meeting with organizations, advocating for causes that required her presence across the world. He was working on films or staying home, grounded by the anxieties that made constant exposure feel overwhelming. Their schedules placed them in separate locations for long periods, slowly creating a distance that neither of them intended. He admitted something that reveals the tender core of their separation. He never felt he deserved the level of fame and attention surrounding Angelina. Her light grew brighter every year, and while he admired that light, he struggled to stand beside it. For a man raised in the modest world of Arkansas, who carried the insecurities formed in childhood. The contrast felt immense. He said he loved her deeply, but felt overwhelmed by the pressure of public scrutiny, the constant gaze that came with being part of one of Hollywood's most talked-about couples. There was no dramatic betrayal, no defining rupture. Instead, it was the quiet heartbreak of two people drifting apart because life demanded different things from each of them. They were pulled in separate directions not by choice, but by circumstance. Angelina was stepping into a calling that stretched across continents. Billy Bob was trying to protect his peace, manage his anxiety, and navigate a world that had never felt comfortable to him. The love between them did not disappear. It simply could not survive the separation that grew in the spaces between their schedules, their lifestyles, and the pressure placed upon their marriage. In 2003, their divorce was finalized. Yet even in that ending there was gentleness. They remained on good terms, speaking respectfully of each other in the years that followed. Billy Bob carried the memory of their marriage with honesty, describing it not as a failure, but as a moment in both their lives, where love was real, powerful, and deeply felt, but ultimately unable to withstand the demands surrounding them. Their story became a reminder of something quietly tragic and profoundly human. Sometimes two people can love each other deeply, yet still be unprepared for the worlds they come from, the worlds they enter, or the worlds that slowly pull them apart. Billy Bob Thornton and Angelina Jolie carried childhood wounds that shaped the way they loved, the way they trusted, and the way they tried to build a life together. He came from the quiet hardships of Arkansas, a boy who grew into a man still unsure of his place in the world. She emerged from the fractured landscape of a Hollywood family, seeking honesty and belonging wherever she could find it. When their paths crossed, their connection felt immediate and intimate, a meeting of two souls who recognized familiar hurt in each other's eyes. Their marriage held genuine tenderness, a closeness that made them feel seen in ways neither had known before. But as their lives expanded, the distance between their worlds widened. Fame pressed heavily on one, while purpose pulled the other across continents. The separation that followed was painful, not because love had faded, but because life had demanded more than they could give as one. 20 years later, Billy Bob speaks with a quiet truth. Their divorce was never about the absence of love, but about two lives moving in directions neither could stop. Their story remains a reminder of love's beauty and its cost. For more emotional stories, check out this video.